All right, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the New America Foundation. My name is Samuel Sheridan. I'm a policy analyst here at the Economic Growth Program. This is a very important topic, the water-energy nexus, and I think we have two of the most kind of dynamic people here to speak about the issue. I'd also like to thank the World Policy Institute for co-sponsoring this event. They've been instrumental in putting it together and reaching out to their New York audience. I know we have a number of people online, so I'd like to welcome them also into the kind of online virtual community and watching this event over the internet. So as I said, this is a critical issue, the water-energy nexus, and these two authors have put together, a series of data points and I think policy implications that all of you are going to find extremely interesting and, very provocative. I don't want to get in the way between, the two speakers and your interest, so I'm going to go ahead and introduce Michelle Wucker, who's going to be our first speaker. Michelle Wucker is the president of the World Policy Institute, a center for global thought leadership, and also the publisher of the World Policy Journal. She's the co-author of the paper you'll find in the lobby, The Water-Energy Nexus. She's a young leader of the World Economic Forum. She's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. She's also the author of two books. Most recently, she wrote Lockout: Why America Keeps Getting Immigration Wrong When Our Prosperity Depends on Getting It Right. Our second speaker will be Diana Glassman. She's the co-author of the Water-Energy Nexus. She's a board member at the World Policy Institute. She's a consultant to EBG Capital, an advisory firm for environmental investing and investments in energy and resource scarcity. She has clients in the alternative transportation fuel space, but also in oil and gas. So she kind of spans the gamut of kind of all different kinds of energy and energy sector issues. She's the former head of the Americas for Credit Suisse's Environmental Business Group. So the way this is going to work, we're going to first hear from Michelle Wucker, and she's going to kind of introduce the paper and the methodology and how they put this together. Then we're going to hear from Diana Glassman, who's going to kind of take you through all of the numbers and all the implications of all of this. And then after that, I want to do kind of a robust Q&A session with all of you because I know you're here to ask your questions and figure out how this impacts your various sectors and government, business, economics, the energy sector, military. So thank you all of you for coming, and please give a warm welcome to Michelle Wucker.
Thanks, Sam. It's great to be here. We love working with the New America Foundation, so it's fantastic to do yet another successful collaboration. I wanted to talk a little bit about how this paper came about. One of the things we try very hard to do at the World Policy Institute is to take complex policy issues with implications that go across borders and around the world and try to translate them from the wonks to a general audience. We think it's very important to do something in a context that makes sense to policymakers, but that also can reach out to their constituents. So we were sitting around doing a brainstorming session, and Diana was talking about this nexus between water and energy and what might be a useful contribution to the debate. And we started out with what we thought, later we found out much to our dismay was not the case, a very simple project, a series of short fact sheets about the water impact of various kinds of energy. Well, a year later, we discovered that the data was really kind of spotty. It wasn't very easy to go and find one source. There were lots of different people saying different things on different kinds of energy. In some cases, the numbers hadn't quite caught up with the new technologies that were being introduced rapidly. So Diana and some of our research associates at the Institute went through the data, figured out what was the most reliable, in particular a report put together by 12 of the national labs, and used that base data to do some further analysis to put some of these numbers into a context that people could relate to. How much water does it take to run your air conditioner? How much water does it take to go from New York to DC, as we just did, round trip, or around the world, from Rio to Sao Paulo, other places. And we went into it in a really interesting collaboration. Diana's the one who really, really knows this stuff inside out, backwards and forwards. I was really impressed by her knowledge. I was the one who comes in with the policy context and the sort of there's no really dumb question, but the questions for dummies, like why are we focusing on consumption rather than withdrawal or pollution. We found that there's a lot of confusion in the media over what we're talking about when we talk about water use. And in fact, during the course of the paper, Diana and I had a long conversations about how actually to describe consumption, which is water that disappears when you use it, as opposed to withdrawal, that this water that's taken out of the system and then put back out. And we had a little bit of a debate over the word permanently to describe how long this water is taken out of the system. It may evaporate and come back in another form, but basically consumption means that the water is taken out of the system for a longer term basis. We found in a lot of news articles, this was jumbled, particularly in articles on nuclear issues. So we felt it was very, very important to explain that. Another distinction that we found was very important to communicate to a broader public was the distinction between how energy is used for transportation and for electricity. The kinds of things that to people in the industry, experts in this, which I know include a lot of you in the room and online, things that people take for granted, but that to the to a broader audience, it's really, really important to explain in trying to get more people to understand why it's so important that water be part of the energy agenda. We've done a really good job over the last several years in getting carbon on the energy agenda. Water is not there yet, but it should be. Water consumption is going up quite dramatically. We're introducing all kinds of new technologies to reduce the carbon impact of energy without necessarily taking into account its impact on water. And we have a little bit of a debate saying, are you gonna smother to death from carbon, or are you gonna be parched to death from all the droughts? And I think it's an important debate to have. So in some ways, water is the new carbon. And there are lots of policy implications, which I think we're really just at the very beginning of starting to examine. And when we talk about policy at the World Policy Institute, we talk in a much broader way than just thinking about what a government does. We see policy as stretching all the way down to individual decisions that people make, to decisions that companies make in their planning, and certainly government at all levels, from the local up to the state and to the national level, and on the multinational level, particularly when watersheds cross borders and you get upstream, downstream issues, you end up having a lot of very, very important questions about how the water is used, how what's happening in one country impacts the water supply in another country. We've found that there's a lot of information that still needs to be figured out about what the cost implications are for various technologies that might reduce water use. It also varies depending on the water availability. The discussion in New York State is going to be very, very different from the one that's in Arizona. I think in the Southwest, the idea of water being important is much more on the agenda than it is up here in the Northeast. But it's something that the whole country in the United States needs to think about a lot more, and countries around the world, particularly as some of the new technologies that are being developed are being considered in other countries, and some of them quite controversial, such as fracking, which I think Diana will talk about in a little bit. So with that context, I'm going to turn it over to Diana, who will give you a little bit better idea of what the numbers are and what this really, really means, hopefully in a way that will be useful to both the practitioners and the experts, and to the dummies who aren't really dummies, since there's no such thing as a dumb question. Take it away.
Thank you, Michelle. That was wonderful. I'd like to start with a show of hands. We've got a packed audience here, but to give the people who are online a sense of who we are. Military. Show of hands for military. Okay, so light on the military. Government and regulatory. Okie dokie. 25%. Think tanks, NGOs, press. Okay, maybe a little bit more than that. Energy sector. Anybody here from the energy sector? Okay, a handful of people from the energy sector. And other. Okay, ooh, everybody's other. Academics, let's divide into academics. Okay, there's some academics. Okay, press, is there press? Okay, who's another? Water people, water people. Well, from now on, we will not say energy without saying water. So water people, welcome to the fold. I'm going to get started by letting you know that we have got comments from pretty much everybody, from people in the Canadian oil sands, pro and against, people on the biofuel sides. That's probably the biggest pro and against and controversy that we've had. We have managed to encourage comment from all sides, which I understand in this town is a good thing, and very much in keeping with the mission of the New America Foundation and also the World Policy Institute to think independently. And we would like to have some discussion of science and good numbers informing policymaking and business decisions. So with that at the preamble, our goal was to put water on the agenda. And the question is why? Water impacts everything. Water and energy impacts everything. And very briefly, business opportunities, costs, risk, security, military security. This is a key issue in military security, including when you get to transportation fuels. The water, energy, food nexus, that is a concern that is now hitting the security agenda, and more traditional forms of security. Environment. Can't talk about water without talking about energy. Can't talk about energy without talking about carbon. Can't talk about carbon without talking about trees. You cannot talk about trees without talking about ag. So it comes right back. This is a complex. So I very much think of this as a complex. Justice, there are some people you cannot even talk about price. The concept of price and water muddles things, brings a lot of emotion in. So how do you talk about water? The language is very, very highly emotional. And obviously, there are all kinds of implications as it relates to sustainable development. So it's girls and women who carry water, is girls and women who do not have electricity to study. And without women and girls studying, you can't have education, which leads to poverty reduction, and so on and so forth. Without poverty reduction, you can't have environmental protection. As Michelle mentioned, there is a lot of confusion in the media. All kinds of good quality news journalists have gotten muddled up in this, and they're policymakers. If the rest of us don't understand it, how on earth can policymakers represent us? Okay, oops, just going to flip through the build here. Bear with me. Okay, so people generally do not understand how much water energy production consumes and how much energy production of water consumes. The two are incredibly interrelated. Water uses energy to move water around. Just imagine how heavy it is to push water around. If you try to carry it, that consumes enormous amounts of water. Wastewater treatment, distribution, discharge, all of that. A factoid that you may be interested to know is that electricity is about 75% of municipal water processing and distribution costs. 4% of U.S. power is used for water. There are increasing withdrawals and consumption everywhere around the world. As Michelle mentioned, we have a three-part framework, and we're focusing on consumption. Just a word about quality. That means basically pollution, but also changes to temperature and the organisms in the water. Withdrawal means how much comes in and then again is returned to its watershed, although it too may have some differences, for example, in heat, etc. And consumption, which is our focus. And why is it that we're focusing on consumption? So I'm going to take a moment to pause on this slide. This slide is basically orange, red, across that band of agriculture and where many, many of us live. And if you were to see this chart showing water consumption and water scarcity over the years, you would have seen it lighter red, steadily increasing red, and projections are a whole heck of a lot more red than this. So it's everywhere. It's the Americas, it's the North Africa, Europe, moving on over to Central Europe, Central Asia, East Asia, India, Australia, so on. Most of us are not immune to the challenges of declining water tables, and if we aren't today, we will be undoubtedly going forward. What this paper tries to do is, I'm not going to dive into all the muddle that exists within the current data, surrounding data, but I would say that every water practitioner, and I mean every water practitioner, would appreciate the notion that there is a paucity of data, good quality data that's apples to apples, that is neutral and scientifically credible. Sometimes it's mischaracterized, sometimes it's politicized. so on and so forth. It is actually very, very, very hard to get good quality data. And what we try to do in this paper is to present, well, we tried to find the best data that we could. So we threw out advocacy-generated data. We threw out industry-generated data. We tried to stick with scientific data, valid data that we thought was relatively non-politicized. We came to our independent conclusions that it was indeed this National Labs study. Others have come to the same independent conclusion. Sierra is here someplace. Kennedy School came to that same conclusion. So a bunch of us independently came to the conclusion that this is the data to start with, and this is where we want to go forward. What we did is we tried to present it in a framework that was understandable. So we are going to normalize it across the amount of energy content produced for transportation fuels. So energy, so water consumed per BTU of transportation fuels, and also water consumed per megawatt hour of electricity generated. That provides some context that we can use to compare and contrast what's going on. Okay, I'm going to pass again on this build, talks about all kinds of problems with the data, why we chose the data we did. And we're going to start talking about consumption. Consumption, about 100 billion gallons per day. Most of it is consumed, most of the consumption out there is consumed by agriculture, both crops and livestock, over 80%. If you look at the bit that's not agriculture related, so there you see it right there, we must have this discussion within the context of ag and ag policy. But energy consumes a large part of the rest, and an important part of the rest. 20% of water ex-agri. And that's thermoelectric. This excludes, as best we can tell, the transportation fuel side. So we're going to start talking, we're going to break our discussion down here into, we're going to start with transportation fuels, and then we're going to move to electricity. So does anybody know what a BTU, how much energy is in a BTU? Nobody? Nobody? Okay. Well, it is one matchstick and 1 million BTUs, which is the metric that the jargonistas and the wonks, et cetera, use and assume that all of you know what it means, is roughly about the amount of energy to take a car, an average car, from Sao Paulo to Rio, Rome to Bologna, New York to DC. So you can just, it's about 200 miles, roughly. That's not perfect, but just to give you some picture in your head. Okay. So the framework, we align. I'm just going to introduce the framework. We're going to align on a graphic the range of technologies that were reviewed by this report, and we'd like to compare and contrast them. And we will try to point out a few areas of weakness, and there are weaknesses across all of the data sets, and some opportunities to improve that we think are very, very important from a policy-making perspective and also business decision-making perspective. Okay, so the first observation is that first-generation irrigated soy and corn-based biofuels consume water in amounts that are literally off the charts. Now, it's an amazing picture. But of course, the people who are pro-biofuels will say that these are first-generation. It leaves out non-irrigated, which is true as the vast majority of these sorts of biofuels. It also leaves out second and third generation, the whole range of technologies that are being evaluated. So jatropha, camelina, algae, et cetera, you've heard them all. Those will reduce the numbers. I've seen some numbers that would, in fact, reduce a lot of this. Nonetheless, it's still a lot compared to traditional oil and gas. We're waiting for technology, and there is technology under development that is hopefully going to reduce the amount of consumption of water that biofuels pose right now. We are going to now talk about, get rid of those charts so that we can see the other charts. We're going to talk about increasing petroleum water intensity. So what we're seeing is that the other technologies, conventional technologies, are also becoming more water intensive. So we've got oil, traditional down here. By way of example, there's the oil sands, the mining approach to oil sands. That's what you hear about and when you think about Canadian oil sands. There is another form of oil sands production which is indeed supposed to drive down the amount of water consumed on the SAGD, steam-assisted gravity drainage. That is the new form of oil sands production, which is going to constitute an ever-increasing portion of Canadian oil sands production. So it's very, very important to understand where that's going to be. That too is, the initial numbers are looking like it's going to be higher than traditional oil. What this also leaves out, see, we leave gaps there to try to encourage people to use this framework and fill it in. What this also excludes is enhanced oil recovery. So as petroleum gets harder and harder, we're trying to do all kinds of things to get it out of the ground. Whoops, uh-oh. Okay, help. Okay, Hillary is going to help us. But in the meantime, there are enhanced oil recovery techniques to try to get more of what's down there out there. And many of these involve pouring water down, sometimes not dirty water, sometimes fresh water. And when we talk about carbon capture and sequestration, many people think that we can capture some of that CO2 and sequester it, push it down into these oil fields. Well, that too, using current technologies, can consume an enormous amount of water. So if we're thinking about carbon capture and storage, we shouldn't just be thinking about carbon. We need to think about what that means for water, assuming that we could capture meaningful amounts of carbon and assuming that we could actually put it down there. That will have massive water consumption implications, again, using currently contemplated technologies. Natural gas is a major area of contention right now. Oops. Uh-oh. Okay. Well, what you will see in the natural gas slide, once it comes up, is a similar picture. You will find conventional natural gas drilling down there, a relatively small amount of consumption. Right there.
Just be careful not to hit the center button.
Aha.
Just the two arrows.
Got it. Thank you. So it's me. I will put down papers. So you will see natural gas, if you recollect, compared versus oil. Conventional is actually the most water efficient means of producing a BTU. So it consumes less water than any other form of energy thus far, based on a per BTU basis. Unconventional natural gas, shale. Well, we've talked enormous amounts about the consumption issue, the quality issues. That's important, but we also think that consumption is going to become more important and needs to be part of the discussion, especially as hydraulic fracking techniques start moving into oil fields and also internationally. Most people don't know that over 50% of the rigs in the United States right now have moved from natural gas to oil. And it just so happens that by chance or otherwise, some of these oil drilling areas are more water deprived than, say, here in the Northeast, where we've heard about the Marcellus Shale. So I'd point to the Bakken Shale, as well as Permian Basin, which are very large drivers of growth of oil production right now. So we need to figure out what those numbers are, and I am working with people, and I think we really don't know what the footprint is. We don't really know what the consumption is, and that is another area where we need to get credible, reputable information so that all of us can figure out how to manage these activities going forward. Move forward. Okay. Just going forward, electricity. Megawatt hour is a kilowatt hour is 10 100-watt light bulbs. You will be familiar with that from your electricity bill. And plasma screen TV consumes a lot of energy. Just to give you a frame of reference, using the same framework, water consumption per unit of energy produced. This would be the megawatt hours by electricity. You will find first that on conventional forms of electricity generation down here, they actually consume a relatively tight band of water. Natural gas is the most, once again, least water consumptive, the most water efficient. It consumes about half as much water as a coal plant that would produce the same amount of energy, and about a third as much water as a nuclear plant that uses the same amount, that produces the same amount of energy. I would say that this is based on your cooling assumptions. It is the cooling process that drives the water consumption in conventional power plants. So there are different cooling technologies. In brief, there is a trade-off. We can withdraw less and chop up less animal life and so on. But that necessarily, given current technologies, means that we will consume a whole heck of a lot more water. If we decide we want to consume less based on current technologies, it means that we will have to withdraw a lot more water and return it. So at the moment, there's a trade-off that needs to be made. And one of the policy questions is, are there policy areas which should perhaps reconsider and evaluate policy implications that require reduced water withdrawals at the expense of consumption. Oops, the build didn't work. Okay, so I will hand right into you. The next finding is that not all forms of cleaner, from a carbon perspective, energy generation are equal from a water consumption perspective. What you will find is that wind and solar photovoltaic consume minimal amounts of water per unit of energy produced again. So they use some water for cleaning and so on and so forth. But when you talk about consumption on a per unit of energy produced perspective, they are the best. I am going to flip the chart on, but it's going to be hard to see. But solar thermal, another form of solar, so we often blend solar photovoltaic, solar thermal, concentrated, blah, blah. We all get, these terms start to get muddled in the public imagination, but you will find that solar thermal, based on installed capacity right here, is surprisingly enough consumes 5 times as much water per unit of energy produced as natural gas. And about twice as much, a little less than twice as much as nuclear per unit of energy provided. And where do we put solar thermal plants? Arid environments. There is a big plant in California that's just been approved before it got shut down by some wildlife. But that added hundreds of millions of dollars and more space requirements to use a new form of cooling that actually consumes less water. But I can tell you that many developers, many project developers, they've come to me hawking their projects, and they have no idea what the water implications are of the projects that they are trying to develop. And they haven't thought about alternate ways of reducing consumption, which will lead to regulatory delays, cost delays, project business risk. These are things that investors and business people are very, very interested in. I will point to another area here on this chart, hydroelectric. You will see that there's some in the US government who believe that hydroelectric consumes enormous amounts of water. Another agency of the US government, equally reputable, thinks that it's zero. Well, what is this? What does this mean? How can two arms of the government look at this and have such vastly different interpretations of the same thing? Well, it all depends on the assumptions that you use to determine what is consumption. So in this big bar that's bigger and by far off the chart relative to anything else, it is assumed that the pond, the reservoir that's created, is evaporating in a way that it would not have done were it not for that dam. And therefore, all of that consumption is assigned to that hydroelectric plant. There are others who say, no, you have to net out the underlying consumption that existed. You have to allocate it to the different uses, whether it's ag or recreation or whatever, and that will reduce the assumptions. So I guess the message here is whenever you hear a number, question it really hard, and hold it with a grain of salt, and be really, really push back on it. Think about what its implications are if that number that you're hearing is wrong or subject to change. I will conclude the numbers piece right there. But I would say that, once again, the purpose here was to put water on the agenda and to help to take a stab at assigning some rough numbers so that we can frame questions and hopefully the right sorts of things that we need to do next as a society to address those questions. So we created a little framework to help us think about this. We think first specifically about the energy issues. We need to evaluate energy implications. And as you could see from the graphic, there were already numerous points of area that could be debated and evaluated further within the energy dimension alone. Emerging technologies need to be added to that framework. We would love to see emerging technologies. As Michelle said, there are a plethora of emerging technologies, would like them added to the framework. We need to attach costs to these numbers. It's great now that we have some rough orders, we can start attaching other numbers. We need to compare them against carbon. We need to figure out what is the we need to then layer on water withdrawals. We need to do much more analysis to really have a robust understanding of what we're dealing with here. Next, there are a lot of business impacts. Okay, there are a lot of business impacts. It impacts new products, costs, risks, so on and so forth. And it impacts all kinds of sectors. So if you're involved in regulating different sectors beyond oil and gas and power, agriculture, food, beverages, financial services, project finance, diligence, private equity diligence, research analysis on industry, what's the impact of this on the hydraulic fracking sector. Electronics and computing, semiconductors, they all use silicon solar, all this stuff requires a lot of water. And there are differential risks. And in our assessment, these are very, very poorly understood. I think that once we have some ability to separate, then we would go back to that front page again and think through, well, what does this mean for all of the different areas that we've identified? Business, security, environment, again, justice and sustainable development. We hope that the media picks up on this and uses it to inform its discussion, because if they don't inform us, then how are we ever going to be able to have these discussions in society? So I will conclude with one final comment, which is that I hope, once again, the measure of success, you always have to ask, well, what does success mean? The measure of success of this audience is if you go away and anytime you talk about energy and you hear people talking about carbon, cost, national security, jobs, you also bring up the issue of water. So I will come back to some of you and I will actually test you. So thank you so much. That's it. We look forward to the discussion.
Fantastic presentations. If we have anybody in the audience that wants to start off, raise your hand immediately. Otherwise, I'll ask the first question. Okay, in the back, right here in the tie and the white shirt.
James Sang. I noticed your first references to the Sandia DOE report. And it's my impression that Congress asked for it. Sandia finished an early draft. It went up to Forrestal and never came out of Department of Energy. Can you tell us something about the history of this report? Your first one is this 2006 website on Sandia. And I was told it went up to the Department of Energy and it never came out of the Department of Energy. And do you know why it never came out?
I do not know why it didn't come out of the Department of Energy. I do know that it was indeed presented to Congress.
And therefore, whatever its history was, presumably, Congress people have heard it. And so presumably, it impacts their thinking and is at least one piece of analysis that they think about. So that in alone is impactful.
Okay, in the back in the blue shirt, if I could just ask the questioners to identify themselves.
My name is Mike Sponda. Curiosity. You referenced that 80% is used for agriculture. I'll accept 80%, and 20% of the remaining 20% is energy, which means it's 4% of the use of water goes into energy. Why the focus on that when the 80, assuming that using water is a bad thing, nobody's supposed to drink anything or eat food, but why focus on the 4% as opposed to the 80%?
You live in D.C.
The 80% does include some energy to create the water.
You live in D.C. It's very, very difficult to deal with ag. That's your job, I would say. We fully believe that you cannot talk about water without talking about ag. It's the water, energy, food nexus. That is what we believe. We started with energy because that's what I happen to know a tad bit about. We also started with energy because we need to start somewhere. You just need to take a stake in the ground and say, okay, we're going to start here. We're going to attach some rough numbers. We're going to improve it over time, and that includes expanding the analysis across multiple dimensions, such as yours. So thank you for bringing that up.
I would just like to tack on, I mean, just from watching, the presentations, it seems like the obvious conclusion, at least from a water perspective, is that we should have less domestic biofuels and more natural gas. If biofuels are consuming the most amount of water, and natural gas is consuming the least of any of the energy sources you point to. So my question is, why is that wrong? Why is what I've said too simplistic, and why is...
Well, it's kind of a yes and a but, okay? First of all, we picked the consumption attribute as the place to start because it's really important because, again, have that chart of the world imprinted in your minds. That's another thing. As you go away, don't forget that chart. It is very important. For that reason, we started with consumption. It does not mean, and we think it's actually very important to consider as well, withdrawal, water quality issues, and there are lots of concerns on hydraulic fracking on the water quality, and by the way, on the ag, on the water quality. So it hits all issues. But then we need to put it in its broader context. So we think it's very important. We think it's a consideration, but we need to put it in context. These are the numbers. The numbers are the numbers that they are. Right now, the numbers on hydraulic fracking are in development. There have been enormous developments in hydraulic fracking procedures and on-the-ground practices that have emerged since that 2006 study was put together. And really, we don't know if that means it's getting a lot more water inefficient, a lot more water efficient. We need to think about it. But I think that as users of this information, I would ask everybody to stay open-minded about every piece of data that's up there and to watch this space and see how it emerges and use the new data to allow ourselves to evolve our thinking. But right now on the biofuel side, it is really what it is. If you see the other data, there are different ways of cutting it, and this is why we want to use this framework, the per BTU basis. People will agree, disagree for hours, but that's what that data say.
Yeah, Sam, that's a really good question, and one of the things that we'd love to see in future research is some more hard numbers on the non-irrigated biofuels, see where that's going, but also look at it from a bigger policy perspective. There's been a lot of debate over biofuels in the United States, the subsidies that are impacting food consumption and land use, and water isn't part of that discussion yet, but it really needs to be because I think it could help to push the balance towards more sensible policy. And then again, on the natural gas issue, I think it's very, very important to think about, okay, it's got one implication for carbon, but on the water side, it's not so good. Are there ways that we can improve its impact on water? Does that change our calculus for a given area, what its water use might be? What are the more appropriate energy uses? The other question on the policy side with this comes down to regulatory issues, how a particular power plant or form of energy is approved or not. In most places in the United States, there's not a lot of coordination between people who think about energy and the people who think about water. There are a couple places where people are starting to try to put those discussions together, but you can't have one hand doing something and the other hand not knowing what it's doing either.
Up here in the blue shirt.
Bob Means, Johns Hopkins. Thank you. Bob Means, Johns Hopkins and the University of Maryland. I guess what followed from the question you raise is we can do our best to reduce carbon, we can do our best to reduce water, but there are going to be trade-offs. The optimum technology from water use is not going to be unless we are more lucky than we deserve, will not be the optimum technology for water use. Conceptually at least, not necessarily in terms of commercial pricing, that means you really have to put a price on water and you have to put a price on the carbon. And that's a pretty well-known issue with respect to carbon. No real consensus. There's a broad range. The question, I guess, is with respect to water is, are we assuming that water is underpriced?
Well, even using the word pricing, as you said, in certain countries, Bolivia, et cetera, just causes hullabaloo right there. You can't even talk about it. let's assume for the moment that we do want to talk about price. The pricing schema around the world are completely fragmented, different. There's no way to characterize them. Sometimes they're priced, sometimes even adequately priced, sometimes in certain parts of Europe, some people believe that. And for the most part, it's not adequately priced. Yes, I do believe very strongly that we need to have some concept of a price. However, the way we're currently going about it with economic value analysis and so on and so forth has been such an analytical a conundrum. We just can't get over the hurdle. There are all kinds of complexities, and I won't get into them. That said, to make a plug for the World Policy Institute, stay tuned, because we do have, or we think we have, a contribution to make in terms of thinking about floor pricing, a basic fungible cost of water, conceivably that could be allocated across different types of electricity types. So we do have some thinking about it that's kind of different from the way it's traditionally thought about. So foundation, if you're sitting in the room, send a donation here so that research can get funded.
In the front.
So I'm Lisa Hodes-Rosen from the Gold Standard Foundation. We certify high-quality carbon offset projects. I just wanted to follow up this last point. We actually came out with the third version of our cook stove methodology, so we credit improved cook stoves around the world. And we do have a water component, so we do credit for water purification now, which is really exciting. And also we are looking potentially at how you can use a market-based mechanism to create a water market. So if anyone in the room is interested in talking about that, please come find me.
Collaborate.
Great. Right here in the front.
Pierce Corden with the American Association for the Advancement of Science. I'd like to go to your distinctions between consumption and withdrawal. It strikes me that might be a good place to focus in a more analytical and comprehensive way and tie it to such things as, particularly in the overwhelming water use in agriculture, as to whether some of that water is getting down into aquifers and is actually then used at later times. The other side of that would be the evaporation and whether that's affecting the hydrologic cycle and causing more precipitation that then does get used. So I'm a little troubled by this sort of distinction that you make in more or less absolute terms. You do recognize, as you said, that there's some places where you have to think about it, but I would think for the at least for people who have some scientific appreciation of the situation, spelling that out in a good bit more detail and doing more analysis on that might be very helpful, but I'd be interested in your thoughts on that too.
I'll take a stab at that. Absolutely. I mean, what we want with our paper is to put a stake in the ground, a framework to help add more information, and really an appeal to everybody to think about water in all its dimensions, including, as you say, ag consumption, aggregate numbers of aggregate consumption, aggregate withdrawals. Because what we did is we broke it down on a per BTU basis. Well, what we really need to do next step is aggregate it for all the different, so on and so forth. So there's multiple ways we would ask people to take this information and really in a credible scientific manner add to it. That said, the chart on water scarcity, aquifers are going down around the world. Yes, there are places where we're getting way too much rain, and that's part of the picture, but in broad form, stepping back, that picture just keeps getting more and more and more red. So I guess I would pause right there for comments or reactions.
Okay, along the aisle in the blue shirt.
Yeah, hi, I'm Ed Newton. I'm a freelance journalist. You talked very passingly about fracking, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about it. And it seems to be one area where some people are getting sort of excited about the disappearance of water. As I understand it, they use water to blast the oil out of really deep strata, and the water that's used is not only contaminated, but it's sort of like permanently sequestered down in those lower depths and never to be seen again. I mean, talk about removal from the cycle, isn't it? Is this what's happening? Am I understanding this correctly? And are people getting excited about it?
Yes, people are getting excited about it. Sometimes people have philosophy, so they know the right answer, irrespective of what the data show. Sometimes people go around and characterize it because they know the right answer, and have an impatience for finding information. And this is true on both sides. So this is an example of how we're not necessarily making friends. That said, I just wanted to break down your question and perhaps use this as a model of how we would like to address these questions. So your question attacked all three of the dimensions of water. One was the quality issue, the pollution, what goes into the wells, the cocktail, as some people say, and what goes out and how that waste is treated. Then there is the withdrawal question. So yes, water is withdrawn. It tends to be withdrawn in a large amount at one time when the fracking is done, and there are all kinds of issues associated with pulling a lot of water out of the streams and ponds and what have you in the aquifers and putting them back. Some of the water is recycled. Lots of the water is recycled. And then there's the consumption issue. This paper, again, happened to focus on consumption. We know that fracking is expanding into more arid areas. So while the debate thus far, at least in this part of the world, has focused on quality, the first consideration, it will also invariably start talking also about a quantity, both on the withdrawal front and also on the consumption front. I can give you my personal views, and I'd be very, very happy to do that, as I have. But actually, in the interest of really putting the information out there, I won't, because we want to really think about the data and separate the data and the activity of interpreting it from the, well, what does this mean piece? Because that's the pit in the hydraulic fracking debate that's missing right now. There's lots of this end, talking, arguing. There's actually a shocking amount of lack of information on this end.
Yeah, I'd actually add on the consumption issue. I think that's one of the contributions of this. Most of the time when people talk about water, it's really much more in the context of withdrawal or pollution, particularly around nuclear. I think it's one of the areas where people do talk about water. In fracking, you hear about the pollution issue, but you don't hear as much about the water that's being consumed and just taken out of the system. And that's an extra dimension that we think is very important, that needs to be talked about, that is not being talked about yet.
That said, again, what the data show is that the current body of knowledge is that based on that data, which was scientific data put out by the 12 labs, whether or not you agree that was, you like it or not, that is the data thus far, and it looks like on the consumption dimension, it's really not so bad, and it's actually probably pretty good thus far based on what we understand.
Great. Okay, in the back.
Yes, I just, sorry, there's a one-note wonder here,
please,
I guess.
Please stand up and introduce yourself.
My name is Marcia Johnston. I'm also freelance. And I just, coming back to the fracking issue once more, because it is a very emotional one. So I only got at the very end there your characterization that it does consume, from both of you, a lot of water. There's an agreement with the scientists, scientific information.
On a per BTU basis,
it's actually lower.
What the data show, and maybe we can even get the chart up there.
That would be helpful.
Is that
all of you should have the presentation are all photocopies.
Maybe
so
are the people on the internet, are they getting to see the presentation?
Yeah, they can
download it.
They can download it at the event page. So all of you should have access. So pull up your
So there was a series of charts showing the biofuels, the petroleum, and the natural gas. And again, I'm sitting here saying we need to improve the data, but the data that we got to start off with says that the consumption of water on hydraulic fracking, based on technology that existed in 2006, which is arguably not current, says that actually hydraulic fracking is pretty good. It's only about as much as oil.
Is that because it's being recycled that you mentioned? And the last clarification I wanted to have was you gave the impression that there's technological advance, or maybe somebody is working on this data. And I'm just curious whether it's being obfuscated by someone, or is it going to come soon? That's question.
Oh, wow, there are a bunch of questions in there. First of all, on the recycling issue, that's another example of how we really would like to clarify some of the jargon and the definitions that we either commonly use or that the people who are really deep into it use. And the concept of recycling is generally assigned to withdrawal. So it's the concept of you pull out a lot, you recycle it, you use it, so you actually minimize the amount that you're pulling out. It can be applied to consumption, but when people are using the word recycling, they usually are not talking about consumption. So are there technologies that reduce consumption? Are there processes, even if there aren't technologies that reduce consumption? Are there management processes or the regulatory processes? And where are we with regard to the data? Yeah, this is an area of active scientific pursuit. I'm familiar with some of them. And some of them are really looking at this on a very credible basis. What is the landscape at the aquifers on the surface before and after fracking? So it's not intended to be a moment in time. The wells are going to be dug specifically to try to put in the proper measurements, the real measurements, to try to understand what is the impact, as opposed to using random wells, drinking wells that are sort of there. They want to design the study to focus on the policy questions and the business management practice questions. So I'm excited about that, but it's going to take time. It's definitely going to take time. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do things before those scientific studies come out.
I feel like we're kind of dancing around what you actually think about hydraulic fracking.
Do you want to know what I really think?
Yeah, I mean, the Washington, the over here of me wants to know what you actually think about
All right.
hydraulic fracking.
Okay, so I am a fallen scientist. I was a properly trained science person many, many moons ago, and then I went off to business. But my heart is there, and I really want to know the answers. And in fact, that was, as Michelle knows, the essence of this. Based on what I've seen today, and again, as a science person in my heart, I am open to new data. But based on what I have seen today, I believe that hydraulic fracking is here, and it's unstoppable for all kinds of reasons: economic reasons, energy security reasons, cost of production reasons, availability. There's nothing else out there that's as available as this, and it's here, which has all kinds of geopolitical implications, and people are talking about exporting it. Yet more policy implications. It's important for the military. Obviously, they're thinking about energy security. So it's here. And the question is not, can it be stopped? Should it be stopped? I think that there are people focusing on that question, but I think, it's here. I think it's here. And the question is, well, how do you manage it? And is it manageable? And I actually think it is probably the single biggest environmental issue that is manageable, preemptible, minimizable, primarily because it is not a technology question. It is a business process question. Can we manage the risks and the construction of these wells and the disposal of the water and what goes into it in the first place and where it's done? All of that are things that we can control. Similarly, on the policy side, we can control policies and we can enforce policies. So this is not a technology issue, like, for example, carbon capture and sequestration and wave power. And we know how to fix it today. And I generally think that if we can figure out how to fix it, it is unstoppable. It behooves us to do it right, because as this thing spreads into oil, into other countries, into other basins all over the world, China, South Africa, Poland, and on and on and on, Australia, it's everywhere. I think we really have a responsibility to get it right here, now.
And just to add to that, I think one of the issues that people have with fracking is that so much of it is not covered by regulation, that it slips through the cracks. Haha, that was not intentional, but sorry, I couldn't help it. But yeah, I mean, it really does sort of slip through the regulatory cracks, and it's just not getting the attention that it should. I mean, my sort of gut reaction, not my scientific reaction, is this just kind of scares me. We've had this debate a bunch of times, but
discussion.
Constructive
we're all
exchange.
Open to.
But the question is, could they do it without putting so much nasty stuff in there?
The answer is yes.
What can we control? That's a much bigger question that I don't have the science to look at, but I'm all for getting more science and looking at whether there are ways to do something safely. And, as Diana said, the horse is out of the barn. I think that applies a lot to, to GMOs and things like that, things which my gut reaction would be, yikes. But at some point, if you realize you can't control something, you can't stop something, then I think managing is a very, very important part of the strategy.
Okay, great. So you heard it here that it's here and unstoppable, and then also Michelle's comments about how to manage it. So I think that's a good takeaway. Right here in the blue tie.
There's a lot of blue in the room.
There's a lot of blue in the room.
Is that like because we're talking about water?
Water.
Chris Herman, I'm with the EPA. I'm still trying to digest your paper and get my mind around what you're suggesting. I do wonder if your focus on consumption isn't a bit reductionist if the implication, and maybe you don't intend it, is that the consumption of water is sort of the most important thing that might happen to water, as distinguished from withdrawal in a way that might preclude other uses or so on and so forth. I do also have a question about your tables in the back. When you're talking about consumption, also break it down by raw versus transformation. And I wonder if you could say a little bit about that. I would like to pick up on the point about trying to assign an economic value to water. I think there is a danger with, this is a personal view, with the proposals for assigning a price to greenhouse gas emissions, that if we don't do something about water, we're going to create an asymmetry that's going to be prejudicial to water. Yep. And that is drives an imperative to figure out how to balance that perverse effect. Thank you.
Do you want to go? With your last point, I couldn't agree more. We already have created an asymmetry that puts water at a disadvantage because we're only talking about green, where we want to also talk about blue because they're both pressing issues. And that's part of what this paper tries to do. It tries to get water onto the agenda. However imperfectly we do that, and that's our problem and our fault, irrespective of any sources. We have gone to pains because we do think that consumption, withdrawal, alternate uses, all of those are really important, thinking about the economics of water. But we felt that the discussion out there in the press, in the public, is just not getting anywhere. So we just wanted to start someplace. And we started with consumption, which we do really think is very, very important. I mean, it shuts down power plants, it makes people thirsty, it parches crops. Not to, I mean, we really don't want to discount the importance of every other factor that you've considered, but we just want to start someplace and add them to the discussion.
Yeah, and that's actually a great question. It was one of my first questions as the water dummy coming into this. Why is this important rather than the others? And I think it does come down to this question of falling water tables, things that do disappear, but also that people do talk about the pollution issues so much that they're not talking about the water scarcity issue in the way that they should. So I'm really glad you asked that question because I feel like I'm not such a dummy because you clearly know what you're talking about.
Everybody, and I would point out that the water scarcity question to the first person on the ag, it's going to get a lot worse as there are more mouths to feed, their protein consumption increases, which drives agricultural water consumption. So we're getting more people needing more food, and we're getting a higher water content type of food that they are demanding. So this issue is only going to get worse. And we're going to have to trade that off versus, all the power plants that we need to build at the same time. It's going to be hard.
Shane, right behind you.
Hi, Michael Nix. I'm a energy and I guess now water consultant here in town. Back to this pricing issue. I've done a lot of work on the carbon side of this. We've got a regional market. We've got RGGI. We've got the European trading scheme. Ms. Glassman, you'd mentioned how we have fragmented water markets.
If we have markets at all.
If we have markets at all. If we go to something like that in the States, do you see initially it going? I mean, I just kind of think about this. I remember 20 years ago working on the Hill and there was this thing about coal slurry and moving water from the Midwest out to the West and this kind of thing because, oh, the Great Lakes, we have all this water. Well, having grown up on the shores of Lake Michigan, we really appreciate having that water. My mom's oldest sister lived in Palm Springs. They don't have a whole lot of water out there, so it's, you know, have-nots. Do you see these pricing, as you think about this moving forward, do you see these pricing mechanisms moving forward on kind of, there's going to be a regional market here, there's going to be a regional market? I mean, is this how you see this going? Can we, I just look at, we're doing, we can't do a carbon legislation now.
Nope.
You know, we had Waxman-Markey. We barely made that through the House. It didn't even get a committee in the Senate. I'm just thinking, how do we, you're putting a stake in the ground, you're trying to move things forward on water, draw the connection. How do we go forward? Is this the wrong way to do it regionally?
Well, water is what it is. Carbon is easy because it's fungible, it's everywhere. It's easy, and look at how easy it is. Water is harder than that because it is so fragmented, and there are so many, and people are so impassioned about it, even more so than carbon, and so on and so forth. I think that there is for certain a lot of experimentation with water pricing, water markets. You look at Australia, et cetera, and then there are regional initiatives. Look at Chesapeake and so on and so forth. Nutrients, wetland. There are tons of experiments out there. The question I think that you're asking is how fast is this going to lead to something? If it leads to something, I fear that it will take a while. A long time. I think there will be these regional initiatives, hopefully some of them spread, but I think it will be a while. That said, that's why, to come back to our to some of the thinking that we're doing here at the World Policy Institute, there are notional prices and prices that could be assigned and that could have some justification for the assignation thereof. And we have some thinking around that, and we'd like to put it on the table as an illustrative thought process to help all of us, businesses, so on and so forth, it gives just another way of assigning a price to water, see what people say. People like it, they adopt it, great. People don't, we'll try again. But we definitely have some ideas on that front.
Yeah. Well, there's an opening in water in a way that I think that there hasn't been for carbon, which is that a lot of people already think about paying for water. I mean, living in New York City where the apartments buildings pay for it and individuals, we don't pay for our water. We don't really think about that. But, you know, I know my friend in Texas thinks about how much it's going to cost for the water to water her garden. And another friend in Texas said he got a, friendly but very, very clear note from the local government that, oh, by the way, you don't own your water tables. So people already think about what water is worth. About a year ago, I was
in some places.
In some places, yes. But there are some places, whereas with carbon, I think that's been a much newer concept. About a year ago, I was at the World Economic Forum in Africa, and a really high percentage of the panel discussions had to do with water. And at one of them, people asked, they said, well, is water a human right? That comes down to all of the problems that there were in Bolivia. And I think that there are a couple dimensions. There's the individual use of water where, having clean drinking water, I would have to say, is a right. And then there's the industrial use of water, which is a whole other thing. And I think if you focus the pricing on the industrial uses, you certainly will get people who complain about that raising the price because it's going to be passed on to consumers for all sorts of other things. But we've already got a way to think about there being a price on water, which is light years ahead of where we are on carbon.
And to take that the next step further, there is a precedent for this. We're all now talking about energy efficiency. Well, we should be talking, again, you can't say energy without water. We should be talking about water efficiency. So if we improve our water efficiency, think about the coal-fired power plants that can be not built. Think about the carbon implications of just reducing water efficiency. Think about what it would mean in the arid parts of China if we were to replace some of those contemplated coal-fired plants with, say, gas-fired power plants. That would immediately cut consumption of water for that incremental amount of power by 1/2. So I think that just thinking about it in the terms that you've described, what can we price? Are there economic incentives there? how do we get water efficiency on the table is a really key question.
And actually, I'd add that on that sort of feedback loop that Diana showed early on, that water actually has an electricity cost as well. So if you're looking at the water usage of whatever kind of industry, you're not actually just looking at that water use, but then you're looking at the electricity use to bring the water to wherever you need to. You could go on and on and on with that, but it does have knock-on effects.
And a moment on experiments that haven't really been discussed here in this context, but are always discussed when you're having this conversation in New York. It is corporate contribution to thinking about water conservation, water consumption reduction. There are companies out there who have just assigned a price to water internally, and that has caused water consumption reduction, water withdrawal reduction. There are companies that are completely dependent on, A, both physical water, but also B, permission to operate that their neighbors grant them to open up their plants. So businesses have been thinking a lot about, there's a lot of work going into water footprinting, which I support. I would love to see more disclosure. I'm into transparency, as you can tell. Would like to see more disclosure requirements. That doesn't cost anything. It doesn't require a government or corporate. I mean, if we just say thou shalt disclose all over the place when you sell a house, for example, all of that contributes to the transparency that we need. That will, I think, help us get there.
Great. Over here. Just wait for the microphone, just for our web audience. Thanks.
My name is Aniki. So speaking of water footprinting, that's what I'm working on this summer. I'm a student from Northern Arizona University doing an internship here. So to start, I guess, would be in your data, why didn't you, under raw materials, for wind and solar, you have 0, but there's a lot that goes into the development of the panels and, wind turbines, the metals that are in, those require mining. There's a huge water footprint for those.
Right.
So that might just be a good refinement for your next step.
That is an area that we looked. So actually, this, and I apologize, somebody asked the question about why, what was, whatever was the word, production versus transformation. This gets to that question, so I'm going to answer that question as well. Production is exactly what you're talking about. What does it take to create the source of energy? And then B, what do you have to do to it? What industrial process, that's a transformation, do you have to apply to actually use it, to get it ready to a usable form? In the biofuels example, it was all in the growth stage. It was all in the production stage. It's all the water is lost during evaporation, evapotranspiration, the growing stage. That said, it also uses water on the transformation side. And one of the areas that I do think is weak, as you've pointed out, is solar, because it takes. But this is where we need to get really focused again on those 3 dimensions. There are certainly quality issues, no doubt about it, when it comes to producing silicon and that sort of thing. Water quality, water pollution issues are high. There is certainly water withdrawal issues. Those 2 are very high, and some of the manufacturers of this stuff are some of the best people around at conserving water or minimizing water reduction, but they consume a lot. They withdraw a lot. Now the consumption stage is actually a lot harder to find. We pushed and we pushed and we pushed because we asked the same question, but we couldn't find the data to tell us how much is consumed. So that is, yes, indeed, an extra refinement.
So that would be an interesting perspective, like to expand, or for anybody who's interested, is kind of take this life cycle assessment approach. Because
is that what you're doing in your research?
Yeah, sort of. I mean, you don't really know unless you look at something from research or resource extraction all the way to disposal, because then you're just saying assumption. It's just based on assumption. So it might be interesting to, because you include like the mining and then the electricity generation, the water.
You're absolutely. I agree with you. I mean, you're speaking to someone who totally agrees with you.
And then I had one more question on your data. So when you're talking about, in your paper it said that 1/3 of the nation's corn and soy were used for biofuels.
Correct.
So is that included?
Actually, it's now looking like it's heading toward 40% of corn.
Oh, okay. Well, I was just curious if that's included in the agriculture water use, or if that's included in the energy, because I would assume if it's a third.
It's agriculture.
Okay.
It's agriculture.
So that might be a good thing to clarify also, just to clear that up.
Okay, great.
Thanks.
Well, and by the way, just taking your comment further, so we've now started talking about the data. The next question is, well, what are the policy implications? And Michelle will get I mean, she will have oodles to talk about on this one. But obviously this food, energy, water thing is a big deal. And there are questions about what does it mean to take 40% of the crop and make energy out of it? What does it mean? There are all kinds of follow-on land use questions that have not been resolved. And again, I'm not going to take a side on this, but there are unresolved discussions about what does that mean in terms of pushing deforestation into other parts of the world, and on and on and on. What does it do to food prices? These are all questions, and we think that if we start quantifying some of it at its guts, that these questions, think about that first slide, we will better inform those follow-on policy discussions.
So just talking about forming policy from the life cycle perspective. So talking about informing policy from the life cycle perspective, just to talk about carbon, because I'm a little more familiar with that, specific to life cycle assessment. For example, like the Clean Energy Standard, they're looking at nuclear, carbon capture and storage, and natural gas as, 3 elements that traditionally wouldn't be considered into a clean energy. But, if you go back and look at the life cycle of all these, like nuclear has, very low emissions associated with operation, but it still requires a heck of a lot of mining.
Miss, you have a question?
Oh, it was more of a conversation.
Okay,
but
okay. I'm sorry.
Just talking about policy.
We just only have 15 minutes, so
Just saying policy, it's just interesting to look at the life cycle perspective for any sort of policy.
Couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
No,
Absolutely.
no.
And again,
Thanks for
with
getting engaged.
on the agriculture side, there's so many agricultural policy issues, including subsidies, both the bigger subsidies issue, but also in particular the biofuels issue. We could have a whole other discussion about that. You don't want to get me started, but absolutely, it's thinking about the policy. What do we do about this? Whose bailiwick does it fall under? Because there are probably a lot of cases of overlapping jurisdictions, and particularly if they're talking about energy, carbon, water, who's on top of that? And I think this is one of the questions that somebody needs to really take ownership of that.
And I would say we're trying to be balanced. I think it's really important to be very clear that there are a whole lot of people who are working desperately hard night and day in this room and outside of this room and all over the place to try to come up with sustainable biofuels. If we could come up with sustainable biofuels and, for example, provide alternatives to petroleum-based jet fuel that were domestically grown, if we could do that in a sustainable way, that would not be a bad thing. And there are enormous amounts of environmentalists, economists, scientists working on this. And I don't want to do anything but praise their efforts and hope they succeed.
Okay, we're going to pool 3 questions, and then we're going to ask the panelists to kind of give their 5-minute concluding remarks. So with the camera there, so get a pen.
I'm going to pass on my remarks. I don't know anything.
My name is Li Yang, and I understand you want to bring in the factors like waters, but I don't think you really discuss from producers' point of view and consumers' point of view, what's the cost and benefit for using water or pollute the water. So I'm talking about not just monetary cost for the producer, but also the social cost, both for the producers and for the consumers. So if you take all this into consideration, exactly what do you recommend or what do you predict the potential, or in what kind of progress that we want to go toward, let's say the solar or renewable energy?
Okay, great. We're going to pool a few questions, and then you can answer whichever ones you like.
See.
Anybody else have a question? In the back?
Chris Farley from the Forest Service. As I kind of look at the study, I wonder if we lose kind of the local nature of water in some of these aggregate kind of analyses. So I think like folks in the Mississippi Valley these days would be saying we want a lot more water consumption comparatively. At the same time, we have in other places, and pretty much in any democracy where you get water scarcity, we have policies in place to do it. So Western Water Law came into place back in the 1800s because of mining and water use and water scarcity at that point. Some of this does, I think, get to that. Do we have democratic processes in place to create policies for these sorts of things? But I guess I would kind of push back on you a little bit to see can we disaggregate some of these questions to make them more meaningful in context?
Yep. Okay, great. Do we have a third question? I'm going to leap on and ask the third question, if that's okay.
Yes.
So my question is, as we look at some of the world's largest energy consumers, China, for example, what are the largest energy sources likely to be for a country like that? And hopefully Michelle can talk to this. And what are the impacts on water? So, as we look forward 20, 30 years, the marginal energy demand is mostly coming out of, the emerging economies. How, what are they using? How is the energy being produced, and how water intensive is it? So that's my third question. So I'll let you guys conclude.
Go first.
Okay. On China, that's one of those moving targets. I know that China has been aiming at trying to dramatically increase its use of renewable energy, although that's still, given the size of demand, will still be a relatively small percentage of what they're doing. But absolutely, there are water issues. There are some very arid issues of arid areas of China where they've really got to think about some of these water issues. I don't have the hard numbers at my fingertips, but I can definitely tell you that you've put your finger on something really important.
Do you think that's part of the reason for their expansion into investment in natural gas?
Well, a lot of the rationale for natural gas that people have been talking about already for quite some time is really the carbon issue. But I think that there are issues on carbon, on water, on all sorts of things. Also in China, of course, hydroelectric has been a very big and extremely controversial issue. So I think adding these dimensions to that debate would be very, very important. The question about whether there are democratic processes in place for these sort of decisions, that is really, really incredibly important. One of the things we think about a lot at the Institute is the relationship between or among democracy, economy, and security. And I think that this really touches on all of those things. Right now, I don't think that there are very democratic processes in place. Even where you've got government functioning, you don't necessarily have the energy side talking to the water side. And on the individual level, certainly each person has a decision over how much water they're going to use, but they probably don't have an impact over what the corporation down the street is going to do. So the individual decisions of all of those actors are very, very important, but aggregating them into a bigger democratic process is a step that I think needs a lot more work. So I'm really, really glad that you brought that up. In terms of the cost benefits for consumers and social costs and potential progress on water issues, one of the next steps that we're proposing to do in this research is to look at the various options for water efficiency and assign a cost to what it would take to actually do those things. Would this particular system require a much better grid? Would this require other transport issues? What sort of technology and infrastructure do you have to put in place to be able to use a more water efficient technology? And that circles back into pricing issues in a whole other way. But definitely you're already seeing social costs when people are finding that they've got water shortages. I think probably people in other parts of the world might laugh at Americans who are distressed over not being able to water their lawn every day. But it actually might be a good thing if people watered their lawns less. So it's a very important question that really needs some more work layered onto it, and that's going to be among the next steps that we're going to be looking at.
So I will build on Michelle's comments. I won't repeat what she said. There was one comment, so I'll start about the local content, then go to China, and then go back to some of the democratic and social issues. The local content person, you're absolutely right. And in fact, in our paper, we agree with you. We advocate overlaying a map of energy consumption and water basins. In fact, WRI right down the street is doing a hydrological map on a basin by basin basis, starting with China, and we welcome that. because obviously if you have a lot of water in point A and you're also worried about carbon, well, that gives you a certain set of parameters to work with. But if you are living in a water-constrained place, then other technologies may be appropriate, and there are different trade-offs that you're going to have to make. So we're all for that. That's one of the challenges of water. And again, very little information to do that well. We need that hydrological data as well as this energy consumption data, and we need to marry it. Moving to China, lots of questions were asked there. But yes, water is a key issue, in some instances bigger than carbon in certain localities in China. I mean, they're talking about building canals from south to north to fund water. I definitely think that it's a good push toward cleaner forms of energy. I have a friend, well, a client who is now in a leading wind turbine company based in Denmark, at Children Green Denmark. And I told him, you should add this to your marketing literature. Go to northern China where it's really arid and say, well, in addition to the carbon content, we can cut your water consumption instantly relative to coal. And so, yeah, let's put the cost discussion in context of that. And I think that could be a really important business value proposition for them. So yes, I do think that's important. And again, remember, you replace that coal-fired power plant with a gas-fired power plant, and half of the water consumption. Hydraulic fracking. I think this is going to be a push for hydraulic fracking in China for certain. Movement toward gas, but just their desire for energy independence. They want it really, really badly. And it certainly goes beyond carbon. I think they're going to be forced to really think hard about agricultural efficiency. China is a great testing ground. They've got to do a lot with agricultural efficiency. They're some of the world's largest producers of cotton, some of the thirstiest crops in the world. I mean, there are a lot of issues that they need to deal with. And from a business perspective, the business risk of locating factories in water-constrained parts of China are meaningful. I would say that to counter to provide some more color and context around the local comment, yes, it's local. We're talking about local Chinese issues. But their food consumption, people are talking about food as a proxy for traded water. We don't have prices and we can't move water, trade it. But people look at food, and Chinese consumption is going to drive a lot of water implications all over the world. It already is on land grab stuff. Let's talk about the social issues. This is something, and the democratic processes. The problem with democracies is that some people are more equal than others, and they tend to be the ones who have more to start out with. Therefore, they can impact the political process, blah, blah, blah. Some people critique our own democracy here, and so on and so forth. I leave that to you to decide. That said, I think I studied development in addition to being a full-on scientist. This is something that's very, very close to my heart, and I would like to leave everybody in the room with a picture of someone who is really sick, because they can't get clean water, and someone who drinks the same water that they go to the bathroom in and wash their clothes in and feed their cow with. I mean, I think this is something that is immoral. It's something that we can go a long way toward fixing if we have both distributed clean energy and apply that to clean water, which we can do. This technology exists. Some claim that it's not so expensive, it's robust. It will have so many development benefits. You get that clean water to people. It will improve health, mortality, reduce birth rates, and so on and so forth. This is something I'm very passionate about, and I will again point you back to that little wheel that we drew, that very first page, which was the hardest picture to draw in this whole presentation. How do you use this to inform that? Well, again, coming down to, we think that this is such a cluttered, passionate, confused, emotional, non-scientific issue that if we could just add a few numbers to the discussion and use that to sort of identify some possible solutions, opportunities, ways to both have energy and water that are efficient on both fronts, I would be really happy about that. That would be a very meaningful contribution. I hope someone takes that and runs with it.
And actually, just to wrap up on the democratic process again, because it is such a great, important point. People have a hard time speaking up on issues that they don't understand. And this is something that's very complex and involves all sorts of variables. So talking about it in a way that people can understand, for people who are involved on a sort of daily level to think about how they talk about it in ways that other people can get instead of just talking among other experts is really important. And that's going to be, I think, one of our big goals as we continue with this work, is to find ways to talk about water and energy and food issues in a way that a broader public can hold on to it, in a way that students can get, in a way that communities can grab onto and speak up in as their communities, as their states, and even on a national level, think about water policies going forward, particularly as they're related to energy.
And again, to put in the plug for World Policy Institute, it's my job. We, in addition to some of the notional cost thinking that we've got, we are also very, very thoughtful and have some really good ideas that we'd like to push forward on the water, energy, food nexus. This is top of the agenda. It gets to this question that you just asked. And we have again, stay tuned. We'd like to move forward on that front as well. So thank you for asking that question.
Okay, on that note, I think we'll conclude. So I'd just like to thank the panelists for an excellent presentation and a robust Q&A. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sam.